Caitlin Clark didn't hold a press conference. She didn't leak anything to reporters. She didn't challenge the WNBA Players Association publicly. She did something far more dangerous. She typed a sentence that looked harmless, friendly, almost meaningless to the average fan. No caps, no drama, no warning signs. Just a response under a post that most people scrolled past without a second thought. But buried inside that response was something the league, the union, and even sponsors weren't ready for. Certainty. Not hope. Not optimism. Not if things work out. Certainty. And once certainty enters a labor negotiation, everything changes. Because strikes don't survive confidence. They survive fear. They survive doubt. They survive silence. The moment the most important figure in the entire league starts speaking like the future is already decided, leverage evaporates. Panic disappears. And narratives collapse. What makes this moment so fascinating isn't that Caitlin Clark said something bold. It's that she didn't need to. She didn't challenge the union directly. She didn't undermine them with aggression. She simply acted like the season was happening. And that alone may have ended the strike threat before it ever became real. And the scary part? She wasn't alone. Because while fans were still arguing about pay raises, while headlines screamed about 700% demands and strike votes, the people who actually drive the WNBA's value were quietly moving on. Planning seasons. Talking playoffs. Making business decisions. Which raises a question nobody seems comfortable asking out loud. What if the strike was already over, before anyone realized it? And to understand how that happened, you have to start with the biggest illusion in this entire situation, the strike threat itself. Because once you understand what that vote really meant, everything Caitlin Clark did afterwards suddenly makes perfect sense. On paper, it looked historic. A 700% pay raise demand. A 97% strike authorization vote. A players' union publicly signaling they were ready to shut everything down if negotiations didn't go their way. That kind of language is designed to create shock. It's supposed to scare fans, rattle sponsors, and put pressure on ownership by introducing uncertainty. The goal isn't just leverage, it's fear. Fear that games won't be played. Fear that revenue disappears. Fear that momentum dies overnight. And for a moment, it worked. Headlines exploded. Social media filled with speculation. Fans started asking the same question over and over again. Is the 2026 season actually in danger? But here's the part almost nobody slowed down long enough to analyze. That 97% vote was never a vote to strike. It was permission to threaten one. That distinction changes everything. Strike authorization votes aren't about action. They're about optics. They exist to give negotiating committees the ability to say, we have the backing of our players, without forcing any individual player to actually commit to missing paychecks, risking endorsements, or stalling career momentum. From a player's perspective, that vote is a trap with only one acceptable answer. If you vote no, you're instantly labeled disloyal. You're framed as anti-union. You're isolated inside a locker room that depends on collective messaging. So players vote yes. Not because they want to strike, but because they don't want to be the villain. That's not courage. That's survival. And the league knows this. Ownership knows this. Sponsors know this. Agents know this. Everyone involved understands that authorization votes are inflated by design. They're meant to look unanimous because dissent is socially punished, not because dissent doesn't exist. So when fans see 97%, they imagine unity. What they're actually seeing is pressure. And that pressure only works if the threat behind it feels real. But here's where the illusion starts cracking. A real strike requires something the WNBA Players Association doesn't actually have: star buy-in. Not verbal support. Not symbolic unity. Not social media posts about fairness. Actual willingness to stop the machine. And that's where this entire negotiation quietly ran into a wall. Because the WNBA is no longer a league driven by anonymity or interchangeable talent. It's driven by identifiable stars whose presence directly determines ratings, ticket sales, sponsorship value, and media attention. Which means the power dynamic has shifted. In the past, unions could rely on the idea that no single player mattered more than the group. That concept collapses the moment the league's growth becomes concentrated around a handful of names. And in today's WNBA, there is no confusion about who those names are. Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Sabrina Ionescu, Aya Wilson, Paige Buchers. These players aren't just athletes, They are economic engines. Entire broadcast schedules are shaped around them. Entire sponsorship strategies depend on them. Entire fan bases show up because of them. So when a strike is threatened, the real question isn't how many players voted yes. It's whether these players are willing to stop playing. And that's where the union's leverage quietly started bleeding out. Because a strike only works if uncertainty spreads outward. Fans need to believe games might not happen. Sponsors need to hesitate. Networks need to worry. But the moment the stars start behaving like the season is inevitable, that uncertainty dies. And that's exactly what happened next. Not through speeches. Not through statements. Not through leaks. But through something far simpler. A sentence. And in the next section, we'll break down exactly why Caitlin Clark's response, buried under a harmless fan post, mattered more than every press release the union put out combined. Because once that line was written, the strike threat stopped being a weapon and started looking like a bluff. At first glance, it didn't look like anything. No headline, no alert, no dramatic framing. Just a fan post that blended into the endless scroll of social media. Someone talking about their dog. A light-hearted story. The kind of post athletes respond to all the time with emojis, quick laughs, or polite acknowledgments before moving on. And then Caitlin Clark replied. Not with enthusiasm. Not with speculation. Not with conditional language. She wrote 5 words that instantly removed uncertainty from the conversation. Both are welcome courtside this year. That was it. No context. No clarification. No follow-up. But buried inside that sentence was the one thing a labor negotiation cannot survive. Inevitability. This year. Not if there's a season. Not hopefully this year. Not when things get resolved. This year. That phrasing matters more than fans realize, because athletes at Clark's level do not communicate casually anymore. Every word is filtered. Every post is reviewed. Every public-facing sentence passes through layers of brand management, legal awareness, and business strategy. Caitlin Clark isn't a college phenom posting freely anymore. She's a corporate asset, a walking media platform, a billion-dollar growth engine wrapped in sneakers and sponsorship deals. And people at that level don't accidentally confirm seasons. They signal. This wasn't a message for fans. Fans don't negotiate collective bargaining agreements. Fans don't decide sponsorship timelines. Fans don't sit in boardrooms. This was a message for people who understand subtext. League executives, sponsors, network partners, union leadership. Because once the most visible figure in the league speaks like the season is locked in, it changes how everyone else behaves. Sponsors stop hesitating. Broadcasters stop worrying. Fans stop panicking. And when panic disappears, leverage disappears with it. That's the part the Players Association couldn't afford. And yet it happened anyway. Because strikes rely on fear. They rely on uncertainty spreading faster than confidence. The moment certainty enters the room, it suffocates the threat. And Caitlin Clark didn't shout certainty. She whispered it. What made it even more devastating is how easy it was to dismiss. Anyone looking to downplay it could say the same thing. It's just a social media post. She didn't mean anything by it. People are reading too much into this. But that's exactly how strategic messaging works. The most effective signals don't look aggressive. They look normal. They blend in. They slide past resistance because they don't trigger alarms. And Clark knows this better than anyone. She's spent years under scrutiny. Every shot dissected. Every interview analyzed. Every expression turned into a headline. She's learned that silence creates speculation, but subtle confidence creates direction. By using casual language to confirm something massive, she reframed the entire conversation without ever stepping into conflict. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. If the season truly was in danger, there is no chance, zero, that post stays up. Not with Nike watching. Not with agents involved. Not with the league's legal teams aware of the optics. If uncertainty was real, that sentence would have been walked back. Clarified. Softened. Something like, hope to see you courtside soon, or can't wait for what's ahead. But that didn't happen. The post stayed. The language stayed. The certainty stayed. Which tells you everything. And Caitlin Clark wasn't reckless enough to do that alone. She had coverage. Because almost immediately, another star started doing the same thing, just in a completely different voice. And that's when the illusion officially broke. Because once more than one cornerstone of the league starts talking like the future is guaranteed, it stops looking accidental. It starts looking coordinated, or worse for the union, inevitable. And in the next section, we'll talk about Angel Reese, why her words mattered just as much, why her role is completely different from Clark's, and why together they represent something the Players Association cannot overpower. If Caitlin Clark's message was quiet and surgical, Angel Reese's was blunt and impossible to miss. She didn't talk about negotiations. She didn't mention unions. She didn't reference pay or labor at all. She talked about winning, playoffs, chemistry, building something real with her team, turning potential into results. And just like Clark, she spoke in a way that removed doubt from the timeline. Not if the season happens, not when things get figured out, but when the season starts. That difference is subtle, but it's deadly in negotiations. Because Angel Reese occupies a completely different lane in the WNBA ecosystem. And that's exactly why her words mattered just as much. Caitlin Clark brings the casual audience, the crossover viewers, the people who weren't watching the WNBA 2 years ago but suddenly know game times, rivalries, and storylines. She's the bridge between basketball culture and mainstream attention. Angel Reese is something else. She brings intensity. She brings friction. She brings arguments, debates, and non-stop engagement. Every league needs a villain and a hero, but the WNBA doesn't have clean lines anymore. Clark and Reese aren't opposites. They're twin engines driving attention from different directions. One pulls people in with precision. The other pulls people in with emotion. And both just behaved like the season was inevitable. That's what should have set off alarms. Because if this were a real standoff, if the strike threat actually had teeth, these two would be the last players speaking in absolutes. Their teams would have advised caution. Their agents would have demanded softer language. Their brands would have avoided anything that could undermine leverage. Instead, Reese spoke like someone with a schedule to keep. And that's the key distinction. When players talk hypothetically, they hedge. They use language like hopefully, we'll see, or depending on what happens. Reese did none of that. She spoke with the confidence of someone preparing for a season, not bracing for a shutdown. And it wasn't arrogance. It was alignment. Because Reese understands her value just as clearly as Clark understands hers, even if they express it differently. The league doesn't thrive without Clark's ratings. It doesn't thrive without Reese's drama. Remove either one, and momentum stalls. Remove both, the entire growth narrative collapses. And the union knows that, which is why this moment mattered so much. The Players Association needs stars to maintain ambiguity. They need fans unsure. They need sponsors nervous. They need networks hedging their bets. But instead, the two most polarizing, most talked about figures in the league casually told everyone the same thing. Relax. The season is happening. And once that message sinks in, everything else becomes theater. The strike vote loses weight. The demands lose urgency. The pressure evaporates. Because fans stop worrying. And when fans stop worrying, sponsors stop worrying. And when sponsors stop worrying, the league stops feeling threatened. That's how power shifts without a press release. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Because what Clark and Reese did wasn't betrayal. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. They aren't just players anymore. They are brands, businesses, and the faces of a league trying to break through. Missing a season doesn't just cost them salary. It costs momentum, visibility, and leverage they may never get back. And they know it, which is why their behavior wasn't reckless. It was rational. And once you understand that, the entire strike narrative starts to feel shaky. Because now the question isn't whether the Players Association can strike. It's whether the people who matter most would ever allow it to happen. And to answer that, you have to look at who actually holds power in modern sports negotiations, because it's not the committees and it's not the votes. It's the individuals who move money. And in the next section, we'll break down why star power now outweighs union power in the WNBA, and why this shift may already be irreversible. There was a time when collective bargaining actually meant collective, when leagues could function without any one individual, when missing a single star hurt but didn't destabilize the product, when unions could credibly threaten shutdowns because owners feared losing everything, not just a portion of the spotlight. That era doesn't exist anymore. Modern sports leagues don't run on parity, they run on concentration. Attention, revenue, and cultural relevance cluster around a small group of names. The WNBA is no exception. In fact, it might be the most extreme example of this shift happening in real time. Because the league's recent growth isn't evenly distributed. It's spiked, and that spike has names attached to it. Ticket prices don't surge evenly across markets. National broadcasts don't pull identical ratings. Social media engagement doesn't spread equally across rosters. It follows stars. That's why this negotiation never had the leverage people thought it did. Unions derive power from the idea that all labor is equally necessary. But when the product itself is built around specific individuals, that assumption collapses. If a season happens without role players, the league survives. If a season happens without stars, it doesn't. And everyone involved understands that reality, even if they won't say it publicly. This is why the informal power rankings in the WNBA matter more than official titles. Caitlin Clark isn't on the negotiating committee. Angel Reese isn't drafting proposals. Sabrina Ionescu isn't issuing union statements. Aya Wilson isn't threatening work stoppages. Paige Buchers hasn't even played a professional game yet. And yet, these 5 names dictate the league's direction more than anyone sitting at the table. Because negotiations don't revolve around fairness. They revolve around risk. And the biggest risk facing the league isn't a strike vote. It's losing momentum at the exact moment public interest finally arrived. This is where the Players Association's strategy quietly ran into a wall. Their leverage depended on creating uncertainty without alienating the stars. They needed everyone aligned, silent, and cautious. Instead, the stars moved forward. Not in opposition, but independently. And independence is the most dangerous thing a union can't control. Because once stars begin acting in their own economic interest, collective leverage fractures. That doesn't mean players stop supporting higher pay. It means priorities diverge. A role player can afford to miss a season if it results in a higher long-term deal. A star cannot afford to lose the spotlight while the iron is hot. Every missed game is a missed endorsement opportunity, a missed audience, a missed expansion of brand equity. For Caitlin Clark, a lost season isn't just lost salary. It's lost momentum in the biggest branding window of her career. For Angel Reese, it's lost narrative control, lost rivalry juice, lost visibility. And for the league as a whole, it's catastrophic. Which leads to a harsh truth the union can't openly acknowledge. They need the stars more than the stars need them. That's why Clark and Reese didn't posture. They didn't threaten. They didn't posture for leverage. They behaved like business operators. Because business doesn't wait for negotiations to conclude. It plans around inevitability. And once that happens, the strike threat stops being leverage and starts becoming noise. But even star power isn't the final boss in this situation. Because there's an entity involved that doesn't care about votes, solidarity, or optics. An entity that has more money invested than most franchises. An entity that doesn't negotiate, it dictates. And once they enter the picture, the entire labor dispute shrinks instantly. Because the 6th most powerful player in the WNBA isn't a player at all. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the swoosh, and why Nike's presence alone may have ended this standoff before it ever escalated. While fans argued about percentages and timelines, the most powerful entity in this entire situation never said a word publicly. They didn't need to. Nike doesn't issue statements during labor disputes. Nike doesn't tweet about solidarity. Nike doesn't posture. Nike moves money. And money doesn't wait for uncertainty. Here's the reality most people don't fully grasp yet. Nike's investment in Caitlin Clark alone outweighs the value of entire WNBA franchises. That's not hype. That's how modern sports branding works. Signature athletes aren't endorsement deals anymore. They're long-term capital projects. Factories, marketing campaigns, global distribution, international licensing, none of that happens on maybe. It happens on certainty. And Nike doesn't bet on seasons that might not exist. Which is why the Super Bowl commercial rumor matters so much. The Super Bowl isn't just another ad slot. It's the single most scrutinized marketing event in sports. Every frame is planned months, sometimes years in advance. Every message is deliberate. And every athlete featured is positioned as a cornerstone of their sport. You don't introduce a signature shoe to the world during the Super Bowl if there's even a small chance the league shuts down weeks later. That would be corporate malpractice. Which means Nike already knows something the public negotiations are pretending not to. The season is locked in. And once Nike acts like that's true, everyone else falls in line. Because Nike doesn't react to leagues. Leagues react to Nike. If Nike schedules production, the league schedules games. If Nike activates campaigns, broadcasters activate coverage. If Nike builds timelines, negotiations accelerate. That's the power dynamic nobody wants to say out loud. And Caitlin Clark sits at the center of it. She isn't just a player Nike supports. She's the face of a strategic shift. Women's basketball finally has a crossover figure with global appeal, and Nike isn't letting that moment slip because of internal labor theater. That's why Clark's words carried so much weight. They weren't just her words. They were aligned with Nike's calendar. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the Players Association. You can threaten to strike against ownership. You can pressure the league office. You can mobilize public opinion. But you cannot threaten Nike. Nike doesn't negotiate from fear. They dictate from leverage. And if they decide the season is happening, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when Nike commits, sponsors follow. When sponsors follow, networks follow. And when networks follow, the league has no incentive to entertain shutdown scenarios. At that point, the union's strongest weapon becomes symbolic, which is exactly what we're watching unfold. The strike threat still exists, technically. The vote still stands on paper. But the real power players have already moved on. And that leaves the union in a dangerous position. They still need to look tough. They still need to justify the threat. They still need to extract maximum concessions. But the moment everyone else stops believing the threat is real, the leverage collapses. And that's why the union's messaging started to feel louder, not stronger. Because volume often increases when confidence decreases. And in the next section, we're going to break down why the union has to keep up the appearance of a nuclear option, even if they know they can't actually use it. Because what we're witnessing isn't defiance. It's negotiation theater. From the outside, the strike threat sounds powerful. A season wiped out, revenue frozen, pressure applied from every direction. But inside the negotiating room, everyone understands something the public rarely does. A strike is not a goal. It's a threat. And threats only work if the other side believes you'll actually follow through. That's the problem the Players Association is facing right now. They need the strike threat to exist, because without it, there is no leverage. If the union openly admits the season can't be canceled, negotiations end instantly. Ownership waits them out. Sponsors breathe easy. The league dictates terms. So the threat must stay alive, even if it's hollow. That's not corruption. That's strategy. The union isn't lying, it's posturing. And posturing is standard in labor negotiations, especially when both sides already know a deal will eventually get done. But here's where this situation becomes fragile. Posturing only works if the most visible players don't undermine it. And that's exactly what happened. When Caitlin Clark speaks with certainty, it chips away at fear. When Angel Reese plans like the season is happening, it dissolves doubt. When Nike schedules campaigns, it removes uncertainty altogether. At that point, the strike threat becomes symbolic, something that exists to justify demands, not to actually be used. And the Players Association is stuck playing a role they can't abandon. Because if they walk back the threat too early, they lose negotiating ground. But if they push it too far, they risk becoming the villain. The group blamed for stalling the biggest growth moment the league has ever seen. That's an impossible balance. Especially when the stars won't pause their momentum to protect the narrative. The union doesn't want to cancel the season. The league doesn't want to cancel the season. Nike definitely doesn't want to cancel the season. Even most players don't want to cancel the season. What they want is more money, and they're going to get it. That's the quiet part no one wants to admit. The entire fight isn't about whether pay increases are coming. It's about how much and how it's structured. Revenue splits, minimum salaries, benefits, long-term guarantees. Those are real issues, but they don't require a shutdown to resolve, which means the threat is less about action and more about optics. And optics require an audience. That's why the union's messaging turned outward, toward fans. Because if fans panic, sponsors panic. If sponsors panic, the league feels pressure. But when the stars reassure fans without directly saying it, that panic never materializes. And that's what makes this situation so tricky. No one broke ranks. No one defied the union. No one said anything inflammatory. They simply acted like reality. And reality is the enemy of leverage when leverage is built on fear. This is why the union's position looks strong on social media, but weaker in practice. They're negotiating from a position of theoretical power, not practical power. and theoretical power evaporates the moment stakeholders stop believing in worst-case scenarios. Which brings us to the timing of all this. Because even if the union wanted to escalate, the calendar is working against them. Alternative leagues are struggling. Viewership isn't exploding elsewhere. And the WNBA's momentum is peaking at the worst possible time for a standoff. In the next section, we're going to talk about Unrivaled, why it was supposed to be leverage, why it isn't, and why the data quietly sides with the league, not the union. On paper, Unrivaled was supposed to change everything. An alternative platform, more player control, a backup option if negotiations collapsed. In theory, it gave the Players Association leverage. A reminder that the WNBA wasn't the only place elite talent could exist. A subtle warning that if the league didn't meet demands, players had somewhere else to go. But leverage only works if the alternative actually holds weight. And this is where the numbers quietly tell a different story. Unrivaled wrapped its season with far less momentum than expected. Viewership plateaued. Attention narrowed. Outside of a handful of matchups, the audience simply didn't follow. One name consistently drove engagement: Paige Buchers. And even then, the viewership drop-off was steep once she wasn't involved. That matters. Because leverage doesn't come from existence. It comes from substitution. If fans won't follow the product elsewhere, the threat of replacement disappears. The uncomfortable truth is that Unrivaled didn't prove the WNBA was replaceable. It proved the opposite. Fans want the rivalries. They want history. They want playoff stakes, draft implications, and championships. They don't want a stripped-down version of the sport in a neutral setting with no long-term narrative attached. And that realization couldn't have come at a worse time for the union. Because while Unrivaled was meant to demonstrate independence, it ended up reinforcing dependence. Dependence on the WNBA brand. Dependence on its infrastructure. Dependence on the stars whose presence makes the league matter. Public comments didn't help either. When players suggested Unrivaled could run year-round or function independently, the data contradicted them almost immediately. Viewership numbers flattened. Engagement lagged. And the buzz faded faster than expected. That's not a failure, but it's not leverage. And in negotiations, not having leverage is dangerous. Because it exposes bluffing. The Players Association needed Unrivaled to feel like a viable plan B. Instead, it looked like a supplement, not a replacement. And everyone involved noticed. Sponsors noticed. Networks noticed. Fans noticed. Which meant the league noticed. At that point, the threat of walking away loses credibility. Not because players don't deserve better pay, but because the alternative doesn't actually apply pressure. And this leads to an even harder truth. The WNBA is no longer fragile. That's new. For years, the league existed in survival mode. Any disruption felt existential. Any work stoppage could have undone progress overnight. That's no longer the case. The league now has stars fans are emotionally invested in. Storylines people care about. Momentum that can't easily be replicated elsewhere. And that shifts power. Not away from players, but away from threats. Which is why this negotiation has always been heading toward a compromise, not a collapse. And in the next section, we'll talk about why the WNBA's current position makes it stronger than it's ever been, and why that strength quietly neutralized the strike before it could ever happen. For the first time in its history, the WNBA isn't fighting for relevance. It has it, and that single fact changes everything about this negotiation. Because when a league is fragile, labor threats feel existential. Any disruption risks killing momentum before it has a chance to stabilize. But when a league crosses a certain threshold, when fans show up consistently, when rivalries feel real, when stars become cultural fixtures, the balance of power shifts. Not against the players. Against chaos. The WNBA has crossed that line. Clark versus Reese isn't just a matchup anymore. It's a storyline. One that carries over from college, spills into social media, and creates emotional investment on both sides. Fans don't just tune in for games. They tune in for moments, narratives, and tension. That kind of engagement doesn't migrate easily. You can't replicate it overnight in a warehouse, a pop-up league, or a streaming-only format. It requires history, context, stakes, and that's what the WNBA finally has. This is why the idea of replacement fell apart so quickly. Fans aren't choosing between basketball options. They're choosing between meaning and novelty fades fast. When the WNBA season starts, it comes with schedules, rivalries, playoff implications, and championships that matter. When it stops, there's nothing else that fills that void in the same way. And everyone involved knows it. That's why the league's confidence quietly grew during this negotiation. They didn't have to say it publicly. They didn't have to flex. They just waited. Because once fans stopped panicking about a canceled season, the pressure flipped directions. Instead of ownership fearing a shutdown, the union had to fear being blamed for one. That's a dangerous position. No Players Association wants to be remembered as the group that halted the biggest growth moment in league history. No union wants its legacy tied to stalled momentum instead of progress. And that's why this standoff was always going to resolve itself. Because when the cost of action outweighs the benefit, threats become symbolic. This doesn't mean the players don't deserve massive pay increases. They do. Revenue has grown. Interest has exploded. The economics have changed. But those changes happened because the league stabilized. And stability is exactly what a strike would destroy. Which is why the people who matter most never treated it like a real option. They treated it like a negotiating tool. And once that became obvious, the ending became inevitable. But there's one final layer to this. One group that stands to lose the most if this is mishandled. Not the league. Not Nike. Not even the stars. The negotiating committee itself. Because if this goes wrong, they don't just lose leverage. They lose credibility. And in the next section, we'll explore what happens if the union pushes too far, and why the risk of overplaying their hand may already be haunting this entire process. There's a point in every negotiation where leverage stops being useful and starts becoming dangerous. That point isn't marked by a vote. It isn't announced in a press release. It's felt, and the Players Association is hovering right on the edge of it. Because once the public stops believing a strike is possible, continuing to threaten one doesn't create pressure. It creates skepticism. And skepticism quickly turns into blame. If the season were somehow delayed or canceled now, the narrative wouldn't land on ownership. It wouldn't land on sponsors. It wouldn't land on the league office. It would land on the union. Not because they'd be wrong for demanding better pay, but because the moment passed. The momentum is visible. The stars are locked in. The fans are ready. At that stage, disruption feels like sabotage instead of negotiation. And unions cannot afford that perception. The worst thing a players' association can be accused of isn't greed, it's miscalculation. Because miscalculation suggests a disconnect from reality. That's the risk right now. The Players Association still needs to justify its posture. They still need to show strength. But every day that passes with the season looking inevitable makes that posture harder to maintain. And the longer this drags on, the more uncomfortable the optics become. Role players may support extended pressure. They benefit the most from dramatic salary floor increases. But stars don't live in the same economic reality. Their leverage comes from timing, not delay. And when priorities diverge, unity fractures quietly. Not publicly, not dramatically, but subtly. Through language, through planning, through certainty. That's why Clark and Reese's words mattered so much. They weren't defiant, they were directional. They signaled where the league is going, regardless of how negotiations wrap up. Which leaves the union with two options. Push harder and risk becoming the villain. Or close the deal and declare victory. And make no mistake, they will declare victory. Because the deal will be massive. Pay will rise significantly. Minimum salaries will jump. Revenue sharing will expand. Those wins will be real. But they won't come from a shutdown. They'll come from alignment. That's the part the public doesn't see yet. Negotiations like this don't end with explosions. They end with announcements. Carefully worded statements. Mutual congratulations. Claims of progress. And when that happens, the strike threat will disappear quietly, just like it arrived. But the story won't end there. Because once the dust settles, a bigger question remains. One that matters far beyond this negotiation. Who actually controls the future of the WNBA? Is it the union? The league? The sponsors? Or the stars themselves? And the answer to that question will define everything that happens next. In the final section, we'll break down the inevitable outcome of this standoff, and why Caitlin Clark's sentence may be remembered as the moment the power dynamic officially shifted. This was never heading toward a shutdown. It just looked that way from the outside. Because once you strip away the headlines, the percentages, and the posturing, the direction was always clear. Too many powerful interests wanted the same outcome. Too much momentum was at stake. Too much money had already been committed. And most importantly, the people who actually moved the needle never behaved like the season was in danger. They planned. They spoke with certainty. They acted like the future was locked. That's not rebellion. That's reality. The deal will get done. The Players Association will secure historic gains and rightfully celebrate them. Ownership will agree to terms they already knew were coming. The league will frame it as progress. Sponsors will roll out campaigns without hesitation. And the 2026 season will arrive exactly as scheduled. Packed arenas, record ratings, debut storylines that feel larger than life. Caitlin Clark healthy and at the center of everything. Paige Buchers stepping into the league with impossible expectations. Angel Reese louder, stronger, and surrounded by better pieces. Aya Wilson continuing to dominate in her prime. Sabrina Ionescu fully established as a star. This will be the biggest season in WNBA history. And when people look back, they won't remember the vote percentages or the press releases. They'll remember the moment the uncertainty quietly died. A moment that didn't look dramatic, didn't look defiant, didn't even look important at the time. Just a sentence, a fan post, a reply. 5 words that told everyone paying attention exactly where this was going. The strike didn't end because the union folded. It didn't end because ownership caved. It ended because reality set in. Because once stars move forward, leagues follow. Once sponsors commit, negotiations accelerate. Once fans stop worrying, leverage disappears. That's how modern sports power works. Not loudly, not officially, but inevitably. The WNBA isn't fragile anymore. It's entering its strongest era. And the people who matter most made sure nothing would derail it. Not because they opposed progress, but because they understood what was at stake. This wasn't about solidarity versus greed. It was about survival versus self-sabotage. And the players who define this league chose survival. If you're still framing this as a union versus league battle, you're missing the bigger shift. Power in the WNBA no longer sits neatly in committees or contracts. It lives with the stars, the sponsors, and the audience, and all three just aligned. That changes everything. It changes how future negotiations will be approached. It changes who sets the tone publicly. It changes how much leverage threats actually carry. And it raises a question that won't go away. If a single sentence from one player can neutralize months of negotiation pressure, who really controls the league? Because the answer isn't written into any agreement. It's written into behavior. And behavior already told us how this story ends. If you want to stay ahead of what the league won't say out loud, the power shifts, the behind-the-scenes moves, and the moments that actually change everything, make sure you're subscribed. This channel doesn't react late. It connects dots early. And the next shift is already happening.